point out there's a reason why I pulled out the Hebrew word kahal here. Okay? Does anybody know what that word is in English? I know it says assembly. Okay? But in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, okay, it is translated as church. In the New Testament, the Greek counterpart to the Hebrew kahal is ecclesia, which means church. Actually, that's what it's translated as, is church, but what it means is assembly. Okay, so if I was going to be fair to the translation, this is what this should say. If Numbers chapter 15:15 was in the New Testament, this is what it would say. One ordinance shall be of the church, for the church, and of the church, and for the stranger who dwells with you. One ordinance shall be for you, the church. Okay? We're messing with some theology here, because what we're saying is what the Scriptures is saying, and what Yahweh is saying is that His people are called the church. You see? And what we mostly have grown up with is the church didn't start until the day of Pentecost. Not so. So, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. Jeremiah chapter 11. The Lord called your name green olive tree, talking about Israel, lovely and good fruit, with the noise of a great tumult. He has kindled fire on it, and its branches are broken. And we find out later He broke it into two. Okay? So the olive tree we know is Israel, and Israel is the church. Incredibly important to understand as we move into the New Testament that we recognize these terms that are defined in the Old Testament. Because how many remember and understand that in the New Testament times there was no New Testament, so the only scriptures that they had, when 2 Timothy says that all Scripture is inspired by God and worthy for doctrine and reproof and living the way of righteousness, he's not talking about the New Testament. It didn't exist. He certainly wouldn't be talking about himself or his own writings. He's talking about the Old Testament. That's what the Scriptures that they had. Okay? So we've got to define the New Testament by the Old. So it's very important. I'm bringing this up for a reason. The olive tree is Israel, Jeremiah 11, and Jeremiah 29. And Israel is called the kahal, or the church. So when we move into Romans 11, this is what we see. In verse 17, if some of the branches were broken off, and you being a wild olive tree, talking to the Gentiles, were grafted in among them, and with them became a partaker of the root and the fatness of the olive tree. Now the root is the Messiah. We don't have time to go into this. We've gone into it many times before. And the olive tree is Israel. So Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12 tells us very clearly who these people are. And that time you, talking to the Gentiles, were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel. Now stop for a moment. Today you are part of the commonwealth of the United States. So far. Okay? Now that may split into several regions here pretty soon, but who knows. But right now we're all under the Commonwealth of the United States. So if you are in the Commonwealth of the United States, are you not under and bound and under the jurisdiction of the Constitution of the United States? Let me say that in biblical terms. If you are in the Commonwealth of the United States, are you not under the covenant of the United States of America? So when Paul says in Ephesians chapter 2 that you who were once without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, the constitution of promise, having no hope and without God in the world, now therefore you are no longer strangers from a different country and foreigners, but you are fellow citizens with the saints. And the word there is set apart ones, by the way. And members of the household of God. So what is Paul saying? He's saying that those who are not native-born Israelites, you are Gentiles, and you are without the covenants of promise. You could not come near to the covenant of promise. Now you have been made near, brought near, and made fellow citizens with the household of God. Now we've always interpreted that as Christianity. They became Christians. But that is not what's happening. It says very clearly there that they are now, they were far off from the covenants of promise of Israel. They are grafted into the olive tree called Israel, and they're made fellow citizens under the commonwealth of Israel. Does everybody see that? We're not making that up. We're not even stretching it, because it says being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel. Now they're brought near and made fellow citizens of the commonwealth of Israel, and by default, you now partake in the promises You see, we look at it as negative when we say covenants, but covenants, we've got to do something. That's not the way he looked at it, and that's not the way Paul looked at it. The way Paul looked at it was life. Remember, the commandments were called life. They were called truth. They were called the way. That's why when Yeshua said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, they tore their robes, because he was saying, I am the living Torah. Okay? So now we're starting to nail down who this Israel is. So these are his feasts, given to those that are Israel forever. And as we just went through the scriptures, from Deuteronomy to Jeremiah to Romans 11 to Ephesians 2, we just figured out that Israel is anyone who calls upon the name of the Lord and wants to be a child of God. There is no other definition that the Scriptures give of Israel. It is not Israel and the church. Israel is the church. Okay? And the biggest mistake that we've made is, unfortunately, from our interpreters or translators, and sometimes that's a synonymous term, is that they use the word church in place of ecclesia. And it should be assembly every single time. The word church doesn't even show up in the New Testament in the Greek. It is assembly. And is a subtle, very subtle way of turning your mind from assembly. Because if you saw assembly every time, or congregation, and you actually started in the front of the book, what would happen is your brain would start instantly correlating assembly congregation to assembly congregation. You see what I'm saying? He calls Israel the assembly congregation. New Testament says it's assembly congregation. We're grafted in, and you go, I get it. But someone changed the word to church, and it got your mind on a different track. So you didn't connect the dots. Okay? So what we want to do is connect the dots back to their original meaning, because the original meaning brings original application. The original application brings connectivity, and connectivity brings power. And that's what we're missing in the church today.